The house smelled of lemon cake and carnations. That particular combination always reminded me of spring recitals and PTA meetings of a time when I was younger, busier, and too exhausted to notice my loneliness. But today, on my 80th birthday, that scent floated through the same house I had lived in for over 5 decades. My home, my haven, my history. The living room was filled with noise, people clinking glasses, Monica's high-pitched laugh floating above the chatter, Brian pretending to be the doting son, balloons sagged slightly against the ceiling fan blades, and a lopsided banner declared in glittery letters, "Happy 80th Mom." As if cheer could be forced into vinyl, they'd organized the whole thing. Brian and Monica. I hadn't asked for it, but apparently milestone birthdays required performance. I was the main act, wrinkled, smiling, always smiling. I sat on the old floral sofa Calvin and I picked out in '78, clutching a sweating glass of sparkling cider. People came and went, neighbors, some of Brian's business colleagues, Monica's yoga friend who kept calling me Marjorie. No one seemed to notice when I disappeared into the corner armchair or when I stepped outside for air. I had become decorative. Only one person really saw me that day. My grandson Jacob. He shuffled toward me halfway through the party, cheeks pink from embarrassment, hands jammed into the sleeves of his hoodie. He pulled out a small folded card from his back pocket. "I made this for you in art class. It's kinda dumb, but I opened it carefully." On the front, a drawing of a small house with roses climbing up the porch rail, and inside, in clumsy but heartfelt penmanship, "I love coming to your house, Nana. You make everything feel safe. Happy 80th birthday. You're the best thing in our family." I looked up at him, and something inside me softened. "Thank you, Jacob," I whispered, swallowing a lump in my throat. "You're the best thing in mine, too." He smiled like it was no big deal, then scurried back to his phone in the corner. But I kept that card in my pocket all evening, pressing my hand against it whenever the emptiness crept in. After the guests had left, the house sank back into stillness. The silence was almost too loud, like the walls were waiting for something. I padded down the hallway in my slippers, cardigan wrapped tight around my shoulders. The lights were dimmed and only a low glow from the kitchen spilled down the hall. I was craving chamomile tea, something to quiet my body, which ached from hours of forced cheer. That's when I heard it, Brian's voice, low but unmistakable. "She's still kicking, but it won't be long. Once she dies, the house is ours. Just be patient." Monica's voice followed, equally hushed and cruel. "I'm trying to be, but she's moving too slow. Maybe she needs more stress." They both laughed. I stopped cold. The hallway rug felt like ice beneath my feet. I stared at the wall for a long second, not sure if I had truly heard what I thought I had. "When she dies. The house is ours." I clutched the frame of the hallway door to steady myself. My chest felt hollow, like someone had reached inside and scooped out something I didn't realize I was still protecting. Hope, maybe. The belief that Brian still loved me, even just a little. I turned around slowly, moving like a ghost back to my room. I didn't want to hear anymore. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long while, my teacup forgotten on the nightstand. I stared at the carpet, at the dresser Calvin had carved initials into when we couldn't afford anything nicer, at the window that still had faint outlines of Jacob's fingerprints from when he was small. This house had been my life's work. Every creaky board, every faded wallpaper edge held a story. Calvin and I built this home together, painted it ourselves, landscaped the yard, fought and laughed within these walls. It had stood through storms and birthdays, grief and joy, and now, to them, it was just real estate. A prize waiting for my pulse to stop. My hands shook as I folded Jacob's card once more and tucked it under my pillow. I wasn't sure what I would do next, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to let my death be the beginning of their victory. The morning after my birthday, the house felt like a stranger had spent the night and left behind its scent. I moved through the quiet halls with a kind of hollow rhythm, touching familiar things with unfamiliar emotion. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Brian's voice again. "Once she dies, the house is ours." As if I were already gone, I wandered into the den after breakfast, wrapped in my thick robe, and settled into the armchair by the fireplace. Sunlight slanted through the dusty blinds, drawing golden lines across the rug Calvin and I bought from a traveling merchant in Savannah 40 years ago. The room was still. The house had always been still in the mornings, before chores, before school, before the world asked too much of me. But now the stillness felt different, not peaceful, heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest. I reached for the bottom drawer of the built-in cabinet. It groaned open like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside were albums, thick leather-bound volumes filled with decades of living. I pulled the oldest one out and placed it on my lap. The cover was cracked. At the edges, the brass corner caps dulled with age. When I opened it, I was greeted by our wedding photo. Me in a lace dress that barely cost $50, Calvin in a suit 2 sizes too big. He looked proud. I looked hopeful. We bought this house with 2 teacher salaries and a belief in tomorrow. Calvin wanted something with bones, as he called it, character. The roof leaked the first winter. The pipes froze in '73. We built the garden in the back with our hands, one flower bed at a time. When we found out I was pregnant, he built the crib himself. When he died, just 5 years later, heart attack at 46, I thought I might never walk again from the weight of that grief. But I did. For Brian, I turned another page and saw a photo of Brian on the front steps, missing teeth and holding a wooden sword. I remember him running up and down that porch, pretending to fight dragons. He used to call the house our castle. He used to say, "When I grow up, I'm going to live here forever. With you, Mommy." I stared at that picture for a long time. When did forever turn into after she dies? The red flags had been there, hadn't they? 3 years ago, Brian brought up the deed over brunch. We were sitting in this very kitchen, him chewing bacon like a man in control, Monica stirring her decaf with false sweetness. "You know, Mom, it might make things easier if you added my name to the title, just for legal reasons." I'd smiled politely and pretended I didn't hear. Then came Monica. Subtle at first. "Have you thought about retirement villages? So many women your age love the community aspect." I told her this was my community. The garden, the porch, the shelves full of Calvin's books. But she kept at it, always wrapping it in concern, never saying what she really meant. I wasn't naive. I just didn't want to believe my own blood could be so calculating. I closed the photo album and placed it gently on the side table. My hands reached for something I hadn't touched in years. The small cedar box tucked behind the encyclopedias on the lower shelf. Calvin's box. Inside were old letters yellowed with age. He had written me many over the years, some from business trips, some just because he liked words. He once said that writing was his way of loving me in ink, so I could reread it when I forgot how much he cared. I thumbed through them until I found the one I had nearly memorized. "If you're reading this alone, I'm sorry, darling, but I know you're strong. A little stubborn, a lot kinder than the world deserves. Don't let anyone shrink you with convenience or guilt. Guard your independence with grace. That's what I loved most about you. That fire under all, that gentleness, let it burn when the time comes." I read it twice, then folded it shut and held it to my chest. I had forgotten that fire. Or maybe I had buried it under years of compromise and polite smiles. But last night's words had lit a match. And this letter was the spark to a fuse I hadn't known I was holding. I stood up, suddenly full of purpose. I moved to the mirror in the hallway, staring at the woman looking back at me. 80 wrinkled hands, silver hair pulled into a loose bun. But her eyes, those eyes still had something left in them. Something Brian clearly hadn't counted on. I walked out back, into the garden Calvin and I had built. The hydrangeas were past their peak, and weeds had started to creep into the mulch, but it was still beautiful. The wind moved through the leaves gently, like Calvin's hand brushing my shoulder. I closed my eyes. Let them wait for me to die. Let them plan and whisper. But I wasn't gone yet. I would guard my independence with grace. And if they thought this house was theirs, they were about to find out just how alive I still was 3 days after the party. I pulled my nicest coat from the closet, the navy wool one with satin lining and wide lapels. Calvin used to say made me look like a senator's wife. I hadn't worn it since Jacob's middle school graduation, but something about today felt ceremonial. I called for a taxi instead of asking Brian to drive me. I told him I had an errand at the bank. That was all he needed to hear. He grunted and went back to whatever spreadsheet was on his laptop. I carried a small folder in my handbag. Inside were documents I had kept for years. The deed to the house, the last copy of my will, Calvin's letter, and the photo Jacob drew on my birthday. Somehow they all belonged together now. The ride downtown was quiet. I stared out the window at the shops and bakeries and old storefronts, most of which hadn't changed since the 1980s. Some days, I felt like the town had grown around me and forgotten I was still standing in its center. Edwin Kane's law office was tucked between a deli and a shoe repair shop, its brass plaque slightly tarnished but dignified. He had been our family attorney for over 30 years. Calvin had trusted him. So did I. The receptionist still greeted me by name. "Mrs. Delaney," she smiled. "It's been a while." "Too long," I said softly, smoothing down my coat. Edwin emerged from his office with a wide grin and a soft limp, the same one he'd had since his skiing accident in '91. Well, if it isn't the last graceful soul in this town. He gave me a warm handshake and ushered me inside. His office smelled of leather-bound books, wood polish, and time. "What brings you in today?" he asked, settling behind his desk. I sat down carefully, hands folded in my lap. "I need to make some changes to my will." He raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" I took a long breath. "It will be, once it's done." He listened carefully as I spoke, not interrupting, not questioning. I told him I wanted to set up a living trust, transferring ownership of the house into it with instructions to sell the property upon my passing and donate the proceeds to the local library. Calvin had loved that library. He used to read aloud to the children there on Saturday mornings before he got sick. Edwin scribbled notes, nodding as I continued. "And one more thing," I said, lifting Jacob's drawing from the folder. "I want a portion of the estate, 20%, to go directly to my grandson Jacob for college, or for whatever future he chooses." Edwin studied the card with a softened gaze. "That's the boy with the kind eyes you mentioned last time." "That's him," I said, smiling faintly. "He's the only one who still sees me." He leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen against the desk. "This is going to raise some eyebrows, Margot, especially with Brian." "I know. Then let's get it done." We spent the next hour reviewing documents, adjusting clauses, and signing with deliberate care. Edwin explained everything, but I understood more than he realized. I hadn't made it to 80 without learning how to read between lines in contracts. And in people, when it was finished, I felt lighter. Not because I had taken something away from Brian and Monica, but because I had reclaimed something for myself, my voice, my agency. As I rose to leave, Edwin walked me to the door. "You're handling this with remarkable grace," he said. "Most people your age come in angry, bitter, but you're calm, resolved." I looked him in the eye. "It's not about revenge, it's about peace." He smiled and squeezed my hand. "You're giving a masterclass in dignity, Margot. I hope they realize what they lost before it's too late." "I don't think they will," I said gently. But that's no longer my concern. The sun was beginning to set as I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The wind was cool, crisp with the edge of early fall. I walked slowly, letting the weight of what I had done settle in. As I reached the corner, I passed a real estate office. The display window was filled with glossy flyers for homes, each one boasting granite countertops and open-concept living. But tucked in the corner was a listing for a small sunlit condo near the community center. 2 bedrooms, balcony facing west. I paused, then stepped closer. Something shifted in me. For all these years I had tied my identity to that house. The paint colors Calvin chose, the squeaky floorboard outside Brian's old room, the garden gate that always stuck in spring. But maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to remain trapped in it like a ghost clinging to old wallpaper. Maybe I could choose something else, something new. I jotted down the contact number and slipped it into my coat pocket, just in case. That night, I made myself a cup of mint tea and stood in the living room looking at the family portraits on the wall. My wedding photo, Brian as a toddler, Jacob's kindergarten graduation. I didn't cry. I simply stood there, breathing in the quiet. They thought they had time. They thought they had me figured out, but they didn't see what was coming. They had forgotten one very important truth. I built this house long before they learned to walk, and I would decide what legacy it held, not them. I started with the attic. It was always the attic that held the hardest things: boxes of Calvin's tools, Brian's old yearbooks, a bundle of sweaters I hadn't worn in 20 winters but couldn't quite part with. Dust hovered in the slanted sunlight as I opened the hatch and climbed the creaking wooden ladder, each step groaning beneath me like a tired memory. This wasn't grief. I'd been through grief. No, this was clarity, a stripping away of illusions. Downstairs, I'd already taken the old china out of the glass cabinet and wrapped each plate in newspaper. Monica had once said they were too yellowed to use at Christmas. I wondered what she'd think if she saw me packing them now, not for her, but for a stranger. I made the call to the real estate office using the cordless phone in my bedroom with the door shut tight. The same listing I saw in the window, sunlit condo, had stuck in my mind. The woman who answered was named Nina Clark, and her voice was calm, unhurried. "Would you like to schedule a viewing?" she asked. "Not just yet," I said. "I need you to come here first." Discreetly, no signage, no brochures. There was a brief pause. Then, "I understand. Would tomorrow morning at 10 work?" "Perfect." I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small framed photo of Jacob on my nightstand. His gap-toothed grin stared back at me, full of mischief and innocence. If he were older, I might have told him everything. But not yet. Still noticed when my eyes were tired. When Nina arrived the next morning, she wore a gray blazer and soft-soled shoes, and she parked 2 houses down just as I'd requested. She stepped inside with a smile, took a brief look around, and said, "I can already tell this place has stories." "It does," I said, But not all stories need to be handed down. She didn't ask questions. She walked through the house, slowly, noting the original crown molding, the light through the sunroom windows, the way the hardwood creaked but didn't crack. I showed her the garden, even though the weeds were starting to take over the azaleas. When we returned inside, she sat with me at the kitchen table and gave her verdict. You could sell this quietly too. There are couples who'd love a place like this. Older charm, great bones. I want it listed off-market. No signs, no tours without my approval. I can arrange that, she said, her tone respectful. Are you in a hurry? No, I replied, folding my hands over Calvin's letter in my lap, but I am ready. After she left, I began the second phase, cleaning. I called it spring cleaning, even though it was late October. Brian barely noticed. When he dropped by, he saw the open donation boxes and the stacks of old towels, and he chuckled. Getting ready for the big sleep, huh? He said with a smirk, elbowing the fridge door open. Monica wrinkled her nose when she came for Sunday dinner and found the living room stripped of knickknacks. Are you sure you're feeling okay? She asked, eyes scanning the bare mantel. You're acting ... sort of morbid. I offered her my best grandmotherly smile and said, just simplifying. Less is easier to manage when you're old and forgetful. She laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. Good. Let her feel a little uneasy. What they thought was surrender was simply strategy. Jacob, however, was harder to fool. One afternoon, he came over after school and found me kneeling in the hallway, scrubbing the baseboards. Spring cleaning, I replied cheerfully. But you hate baseboards. I sat back on my heels, catching my breath. I suppose I do. He stepped closer and peered at me with that too wise expression he'd inherited from his grandfather. You're acting different. Not bad different. Just ... Not like someone who's giving up. I reached out and squeezed his hand. Maybe. I'm just waking up. He didn't press further. Just nodded and helped me up, steadying my elbow like a little gentleman. Later that evening, we baked cookies together in the kitchen. He insisted on shaping the dough into crooked stars, and I didn't correct him. As the house filled with the smell of vanilla and sugar, he leaned against the counter and said, Whatever you're planning, I hope it makes you happy. I blinked at him. Why would you say that? He shrugged. Because I like you best when you're smiling like that. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked out the window. The stars were faint, city glow stealing most of their shine. Still, they blinked resilient, stubborn little things. I thought about Calvin and the life we'd built, and about the son we raised who now waited for me to disappear like a gate. Opening to inheritance, I thought about Monica and her fake kindness, her half-offered casseroles, her constant glances toward my calendar, as though she were counting the days for me, and I thought about Jacob, who didn't need to understand everything to sense what was true. I was doing this for me, yes, but also for him, to show him that growing old didn't mean giving in, even after everyone else thought they'd written it for her. The Sunday roast was overcooked, but I didn't say anything. Monica had taken it upon herself to cook this week. Her way of helping now that I was supposedly slowing down. The table was set like a magazine spread. Candles, neatly folded napkins, matching plates. It all looked beautiful. It also didn't feel like home. Brian poured himself another glass of wine while Monica hovered near the kitchen, probably annoyed that Jacob was still wearing his hoodie at the table. I watched them both from across the table, this perfectly rehearsed couple. The performance had been running for years, and only recently had I stopped applauding. Jacob sat next to me, nudging a carrot around his plate. Every few minutes he leaned closer to whisper something offhand and funny. He had my late husband's timing, quick but quiet. Mom, Brian began, setting down his fork with an exaggerated sigh. You've been really busy lately. Cleaning, donating things, baking. It's like you're nesting backwards. I gave him a mild smile. I've had some energy return. Maybe it's all the vinegar in Monica's stew. Jacob snorted. Monica. Didn't Brian chuckle in that tight, practiced way that always preceded some attempt at persuasion? We've just noticed all the activity you haven't talked about. Next steps. Next steps, I asked, taking a small bite of my salad. Well, you're 80 now, Monica chimed in that syrupy voice she used when trying to sound innocent. Have you considered assisted living? You know, just to take the pressure off, so you're not burdened with the house. I sipped my water and waited a beat before replying. Then, with the sweetest voice I could muster, I said, Oh, I've made all the arrangements. The table went quiet. Brian blinked. What kind of arrangements? I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. Just some things I needed to get in order. A few legal matters. I feel much better having done it, honestly. What kind of legal matters? I shrugged gently. The kind that don't need announcing at the dinner table. Brian laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that comes with a crack in the voice. Come on, Mom, you're not dying tomorrow. You don't have to be all cryptic, don't I? That silenced them both. Jacob looked up at me then, really looked, and I saw it in his eyes recognition. Maybe he didn't know I'd changed my will or met with an agent or prepared to move, but he saw something they didn't. I'm glad you're thinking ahead, Jacob said quietly. I smiled at him and patted his hand. Thinking ahead is how you keep your soul from rusting. After dinner, Monica offered to help with dishes. I declined. I needed the space. Brian lingered, glancing toward the hallway, probably wondering if I had any important papers lying around. I walked them to the door with practiced warmth. As Monica adjusted her coat and Brian kissed my cheek, she paused. If there's anything you need, Margot, anything at all, you just let us know. Brian opened the door for her, and then, with a flash of tension that barely grazed the air, they left. That night, I sat in the quiet of my living room, bathed in soft lamplight and surrounded by a house that now felt more like a memory than a home. I had packed 3 boxes. Earlier in the week, Calvin's books, my favorite kettle, a small photo album just for me. Everything else could be replaced or left behind. I pulled out the envelope Nina had given me the final contract. The house had been appraised and the offer accepted quietly just as I'd asked. A retired couple from Vermont, no kids, looking to settle near their grandchildren. They wanted a garden. I left them my notes on the HYDRANGEAS. With a calm hand, I signed the paperwork and dated it. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Nina's number. Hi, Margot, she answered, cheery. As ever, are we a go? Yes, I said. Schedule the closing. I'll be out by the end of the month. After I hung up, I went to the front window and pulled back the curtain. The neighborhood was quiet. The maple trees in the yard had started to turn, golden light brushing their edges like paint. I remembered Calvin raking those leaves while Jacob ran through them pretending they were treasure piles. I remembered Brian as a boy, too, when his heart was still soft. Before ambition calcified it, I wouldn't get those years back. But I didn't need them anymore. The house would go, but I would stay myself. That was my quiet act of rebellion. They thought they'd written the ending for me, frail old woman in a hospital bed, house keys in their palms, but I was choosing something else to hurt them, just to remind myself that I wasn't invisible, that even at 80 I could still move mountains quietly, or, at the very least, pack them into boxes and hand them to someone else. The morning I moved out of the house, the sky was bright and clear, as if even the weather understood I needed a clean break. A small moving van was parked discreetly out front. No fuss, no neighbors gawking. Just 2 quiet men loading carefully labeled boxes into the back. I had already donated most of the furniture. What I kept could fit into a few simple crates, photo albums, Calvin's letters, a single quilt, the hummingbird wind chime from the garden. The buyer, a soft-spoken woman named Eliza, had sent me a handwritten thank you card before closing. She and her wife were moving down from Vermont to be closer to their grandchild. They loved the creaky floors, the sunroom, and the garden. That meant more to me than any asking price ever could. Eliza met me on the porch for the key exchange. She wore a wool scarf and smiled like someone who understood what it meant to love a place deeply. I hope this home brings you peace, she said. I think it already has, I replied. I handed her the keys with steady fingers and turned toward. Lots of light, a little balcony with space for flower pots, and a tiny table where I could drink my tea. It was a space to begin a Gina luxury I never thought I'd want at my age. Nina met me there with a folder of closing documents and a potted fern as a housewarming gift. You did something brave, Margot, she said, placing the plant on the windowsill. I nodded, watching a breeze rustle the curtains. I didn't think it was bravery, just necessity. Well, she said, smiling, sometimes those are the same thing. Later that afternoon, I sat down at my new desk, a modest thing I bought secondhand, and pulled out a piece of thick stationery. I wrote, slowly, deliberately, not to explain myself, but to clarify, once and for all, that my silence had never been submission. Dear Brian and Monica, the house you were waiting on is no longer yours to claim. I am still very much alive, and so is my dignity. That home held my laughter, my pain, my marriage, and my motherhood. You saw it as an inheritance waiting to be collected. I saw it as my sanctuary. You'll find no keys, no deeds, no sudden windfall. The trust is now active. You cannot reach the funds, alter the will, or dispute its terms without proving I am incapable. And I assure you I am not. I am not angry. If you ever wish to find me again, you'll have to do so with honesty. Until then, I wish you peace. Mother, I folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and dropped it in the mailbox. At the corner, I imagined Monica's face as she read at first confusion, then realization. Then that tight-lipped smile she wore when she knew she'd miscalculated. Brian would call eventually. Probably late at night, after a few drinks, trying to mask accusation with faux concern. I wouldn't answer. There was nothing left to discuss. Jacob visited the condo 2 days later. He showed up with a backpack and a lopsided cake. He said he'd tried not to ruin. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Wow," he said, stepping into the apartment and looking around. "This is cozy." "That's a teenager's way of saying small," I teased. He smirked. "No, really, it's nice. It feels like you." He walked over to the windows and pulled the curtain aside, letting the late afternoon light fill the room. "Do I still get a room?" he asked casually. "You do?" I said. "And there's a desk just your size? Perfect. For homework? Or hiding snacks?" His smile said more than any thank you could. The first evening in my new place, I made myself a simple dinner and sat on the balcony as the sun dipped low. I could hear children playing at the park nearby, the distant hum of traffic, the faint rhythm of a wind chime from another unit. This was not the life I had imagined in my 20s, but it was the life I had chosen in my 80s, and there was something powerful in that dot for so long. I'd equated aging with loss of mobility, of relevance, of voice. But what if aging was simply an unmasking, a return to our truest selves, once we stripped away what we'd carried for everyone else? Calvin would have loved this place. He would have planted herbs in tiny clay pots and insisted we host Sunday brunch for the neighbors. I missed him fiercely, but I also felt him here in the quiet strength of my decision, in the breeze against my cheek and the soft echo of our shared belief that no one gets to decide your worth but you. The next morning, I woke to light pouring through the sheer curtains and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from my new kitchen. I wrapped my robe around me and stood in the center of my living room. I was alone. I was free, and for the first time in years, I was completely, unmistakably at peace. 3 months passed, and with them, the last of the noise. No more calls from Brian, no emails, no surprise visits. After receiving my letter, he had gone strangely quiet. I imagine it wasn't the silence that stung, it was the power shift. He no longer held the pen to write my ending, and he didn't know how to handle it. That Monica, to her credit, sent one text. "We hope you're doing what's best for you." A half-hearted olive branch dipped in varnish and pride. I didn't respond. My world was smaller now, but warmer, quieter but fuller. I spent mornings at the community garden tending to tomatoes and daisies like old friends. I took water aerobics at the center on Wednesdays, and every Saturday Jacob came over with stories from school, new favorite songs, or just an appetite for pancakes. He never asked for explanations. He didn't need them. Sometimes that's what love looks like. Not probing, not demanding, just showing up week after week, plate after plate. Then came the letter from the library, gold embossed and formal. "You are cordially invited to the grand opening of the Calvin Delaney Children's Wing Saturday, 3 p.m. Light refreshments served. Family, welcome." I held it in both hands for a long time, tracing Calvin's name like it was something sacred carved in stone. The trust I'd arranged had donated the funds quietly, anonymously at first, but the library had insisted on naming the new wing after him. "He inspired generations of young readers," the director had said. "He deserves to be remembered where stories begin." I wore navy blue that day, the same shade as the dress I wore to Calvin's funeral. Not out of grief this time, but reverence. I pinned an old brooch to my collar and tied my hair in a low chignon. Simple, clean, proud. The library buzzed with excitement. Children ran across the polished floors with paper crowns and glitter bookmarks. Balloons floated above reading nooks shaped like castles and treehouses. Local politicians shook hands. Photographers snapped pictures, and someone handed me a cup of cider in a biodegradable cup. But none of it mattered until I saw the wall. It was a large glass panel etched with soft gold lettering. The Calvin Delaney Children's Wing, a place where stories begin and imaginations grow. Below it, a bench, quiet, unassuming. The kind of bench Calvin would have loved, just far enough from the crowd to think, but close enough to listen. I felt my breath catch. He would have cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the way he always did. Silent tears and a crooked smile. I sat on the bench for a moment, absorbing the moment. Then I heard Ichaped's voice, clear and full of expression, coming from the storytelling corner. Turned and saw him sitting in a colorful armchair, legs crossed awkwardly, book in hand, reading aloud to a small girl with pigtails and a dinosaur sticker on her cheek. And then the little owl said, "You don't have to be the biggest, too. Be the bravest." The little girl giggled. Jacob grinned and kept reading. He was taller now. His voice was changing. But in that moment, he was still the boy who gave me the drawing of our house on my birthday. The boy who had seen through the mess and chosen to stay close. The boy who still called me Nana. I didn't see Brian or Monica in the crowd. I hadn't expected to. Their absence didn't ache the way it used to. Some relationships die not from one betrayal, but from 100 small absences. I had simply stopped reviving something that no longer breathed. Later, I stood by the refreshment table watching Jacob balance two juice boxes and a cookie plate like a nervous waiter. "You know," I said as he approached, "your grandfather would have loved this place." He nodded, handing me a juice box. "I think I would have liked him." "You too would have caused trouble," I said with a laugh. He smiled. "You gonna stay a while?" "I was thinking I'd sit outside." "Want to join me? I'll be there in a bit." I promised a second grader I'd help her find a book about dragons. I nodded and stepped out. The library's front courtyard was bathed in amber light. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the stone path. I found an empty bench, the kind with the slatted back and just enough rust to feel on a stand, sat down slowly. For a long time, I said nothing. I just watched the way the wind moved through the leaves, the way parents herded their kids toward cars. The way a place built on stories could feel so full even in silence. I thought about everything I'd lost. My husband, my illusions, even the house, though I had let it go willingly, and I thought about everything I'd gained. A space of my own, a life I chose, a grandson who still saw me, a legacy etched, not just in walls but in values, honor, independence, quiet grace. I reached into my purse and pulled out Jacob's birthday card, still folded neatly in its envelope. I kept it with me always. Like a talisman, I read it again. "You make everything feel safe." And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the last of the daylight faded, I looked toward the library's glowing windows and whispered not to anyone, but into the air, like a prayer to the self I had once buried. You don't wait for dignity to be handed back. You take it with grace, before it's stolen.